This is the Keys to the Kingdom podcast, where we explore how the psychedelic renaissance becomes accessible to everyone. I'm your host, Tammy Sanders, and I'm glad you're with us. Thanks so much for listening. In this episode, Kat Orme brings 20 plus years of sobriety to our conversation on addiction, recovery, and psychedelics. A self-described recovered alcoholic, Kat is a participating member of Psychedelics in Recovery and works with others who have grief, trauma, and addiction issues. Her expansive life includes co-founding the Kink Collective, co-founding the Sanctuary for Spiritual Development and Consciousness Expansion, and working toward a Master's of Divinity. Kat's keys to psychedelics access include defining and anchoring oneself in sobriety and developing a conscious relationship with substances. Both Kat and I came into recovery in the 1990s through codependency, and we share experience with growing from addiction, grappling with complex PTSD, and leveraging psychedelics for emotional healing and spiritual growth. Kat, welcome. It's great to have you.
Thank you. Thank you for asking me to be here.
So I came into recovery in 1991, which is 30 years ago this year. If someone had told me, hey, in 30 years, you're going to be on the internet doing a video talking about psychedelics, none of those words would have made sense to me because the internet didn't exist. You didn't do video on the internet. And I really did not know what psychedelics were. And now here we are. And I think you came into recovery in 1993. So it's interesting. I have a notion that we might have some shared philosophy and perspective around recovery. So I'm just first curious to hear if it's a story that you share, sort of how did you come into recovery in the first place?
It was a long road actually for me to 1993 from a recovery standpoint. And I'm in the interest of time, there's lots of parts of my story I won't say. But at the time that it happened, I had crashed through another marriage and was at a place where I was aware of myself as a codependent. I had been in codependency recovery. I had even been aware of myself as dynamically being in the role of addict in this second marriage that I was in, and he as the codependent or the enabler, but I couldn't see how I was the addict. No matter how many empty bottles I took out of my kitchen down to the recycling, I could not see that was me. But the marriage, go ahead.
Wait, and can you also say, because there might be some people who aren't familiar with this, and I also came into recovery through codependency. Can you just say very briefly what we mean when we're talking about codependency?
I boil down codependency to this. I'm busy doing everything and managing all the things in the world, and you don't appreciate me, and I'm mad about it.
That is that's an interesting summary. I could get behind that. I can get behind that. I would also,
as I can be, right? Like there's all the other aspects of it, but the truth is I'm running around running the universe. Nobody asked me, and I'm upset with everybody because you're not in it. And it's like and what? And like nobody asked you.
So one of the things I also when I was at the height of my codependency, it was always too like you are the one who has the problem and I am the one who's fixing it all. And so it was very interesting because I actually needed people who had problems so I could be a fixer. Right. So just one crazy relationship after another.
I'm currently revisiting the concept of the law of attraction, right? And so whatever you put out there is what you get, right? So if I'm busy putting out there that I'm a fixer, well, suddenly all these things to fix are what's going to show up in my space.
Mm-hmm. All right, then. Okay. So you had sort of started from a place of codependency and then found your role shifting to the addict role. And maybe you were having some challenge embracing that reality.
I had some trouble seeing it, period. I literally didn't see myself as alcoholic. And then in a moment, it all changed. And then I suddenly saw myself as I was. And it literally was like one of those psychedelic type parting of the curtain sort of things. Only there were no psychedelics involved at the time. It was just, a God-given moment of grace, as we're want to look at it in the program. And because I'd had exposure to 12-step recovery up until then, when I essentially drove off the Bay Bridge as an alcoholic, I knew what it meant that I needed to do. Like literally, I literally saw two roads. One was to keep doing what I'm doing and keep getting what I'm getting, or go to AA, get a sponsor, get a big book, work the steps, go to 90 meetings in 90 days. Like all those things that you hear about when you show up at 12-step recovery that I used to think applied to other people now applied to me.
Yeah.
And my choice, it didn't seem like much of a choice, right? So off I went.
It usually isn't, actually, when you get to that point, because I think I just heard you say you drove off the Bay Bridge, which, I mean, are you talking literally or metaphorically?
No, what happened? No, my story, the short version of that story is like, I was coming from therapy to go to a CODA meeting from the Bay side of the Bay to the city side of the Bay. So I drove over the Bay Bridge. When I got onto the bridge, I'm tooling around in the middle of the bridge. I had a vision, literally a vision, which informed me of my actual condition. And so when I got off the bridge, I was an alcoholic. I was not one when I got on the bridge.
Gotcha. And by Bay Bridge, are you talking about our famed San Francisco Bay Bridge?
I am.
Yes, that's the only Bay Bridge in America. Thank you very much.
Yes. I lived in the Bay Area for about 20 years. And so I got sober there, and I spent the first 17 years of my sobriety in the East Bay.
Gotcha. Okay, gotcha. And for folks who might not be initiated, the East Bay is the Oakland, Berkeley, Alameda area.
Yeah. Walnut Creek.
Right.
Little further.
Walnut Creek does count.
One east out.
Yep. Walnut, we call that deep East Bay, but that also counts. Absolutely.
It was East Bay, indeed.
Absolutely. So, something that I realize as I think about this, and, ultimately what we're going to be talking about here is access to psychedelics for people in recovery. We're going to be talking about that. But I actually want to start with talking about recovery in the first place, because something I realize is that coming into recovery is different than getting sober. And I wonder for you, when did you realize you were sober? Like when for you did you have some sense of sobriety? I think for me, it was when suicide was no longer a viable option for living. Like I finally had a moment, and it happened in a meeting, and I don't know what it was I heard in the 12-step meeting, but I heard something. I was about 5 years in. So I came in when I was 23, and this was when I was around 28. I heard something in a meeting, and it finally clicked for me that actually I can't keep suicide on the table as a tool. It has to come off, and I have to focus on living. And that for me is, I think, the moment that I sort of count as the moment I got sober. So there's the time I came into recovery, and then there's the moment I felt I was sober. And I wonder if you have that, or for you, stepping into 12-step was actually your sobriety moment.
When you were speaking, I had what came to me around what you were saying, and I don't know if this will count as being the same, but when I got to AA this time, as I spoke of, I got a sponsor who had codependency recovery experience, because that was important. And I did the steps the way she asked me to, right? I had enough humility at that point to show up and do what people told me to do, the way that I wasn't so arrogant anymore that I had to like rework things, redefine things, make things better, like all that. I put that at the door, right? So I did what she asked me to do to the best of my ability. But I came out of that experience feeling like I had missed something somehow, even though I knew I did everything. I had also spent the first 18 months of my sobriety feeling like I wasn't quite sure that I earned my seat. I was what they call a high bottom drunk. I wasn't at that point physically where I was drinking bottles every day and waking up with the shakes and, having big blackouts. Physically, I was what they call a high bottom drunk. My last drink was a half a glass of champagne because I didn't know I was going to have this experience on the bridge the next day. And so I felt like something was missing. So I found a second sponsor who did the steps more methodically, like through the big book, through the first 164 pages of the Alcoholics Anonymous big book. And so I sat down with her, and we literally, in this version of doing the steps with someone, we like opened the book and we read the pages and we talked about the stuff. And she asked me, as I do with people now, when they get that look, I'm like, did you know what those words meant? Do you understand what that phrase was? Because this is old language. This is 1930s language, right? By, white guys. And we, there's all kinds of issues with it today. I don't have issues with it today because going through it with someone, part of the experience of getting sober and like earning my sobriety was like going through that process with someone, you know, to translate the language, to make it understandable in today's terms.
Yeah,
it's
make
like
it relevant.
Well, the bad language almost forces you to have to do that, right?
Yeah,
So it's
yeah.
like you have to sit with another person and talk it out, right?
Yeah.
And talk about what does this mean and how does this translate and how does it relate to me?
Yeah, which is the very crux and the very heart of what sobriety is, right?
Correct.
For me anyway. Yeah, yeah.
So the first 4 chapters of this book are in fact dedicated to the first step. And so part of what I was struggling with in these first 18 months is not really having that experience that to my innermost self did I know I was alcoholic, right? I kept waiting for someone to turn to me and say, I don't think you belong here. You know, I don't think you earned that seat, or, and, you know, P.S. that never happened. But we went through these there's all these iterations in these first 4 chapters about, well, try some controlled drinking. Did you do this kind of drinking? Maybe if you have questions, you should do this. So we went through a bunch of that stuff. And at one point she gave me a test, a mental test that wasn't in the book, but it was in this part of the book. And she said to me, think about this. Could you drink 2 drinks? Not my kind of drinks, but could you drink 2 normal drinks a day, every day for 30 days? You can't not drink them, but you can't drink more. You have to do this for 30 days. And I sat for a minute and I thought about it. And I thought about, like, from the time I was probably, 10, there was nothing I ever set out to do. I couldn't keep myself abstinent from chocolate. I would say, I'm not going to eat chocolate. And then some days later, chocolate would literally fly into my mouth. And I'd be like, how did that happen? No, I wasn't going to do that. I would set myself out on a diet. The diet says, eat this, don't eat that. You're going to do that. Exercise. There wasn't anything that I tried to do for myself that was healthy, that, like, some days later, something happened and I don't know how that. And I realized that, like, I could drink, because I had not drunk for a couple of years at a time, right? Like, didn't have any alcohol. But I could never do that because I would drink 2 drinks a day, and then somewhere 10, 8, 5, whatever days into it, I would forget that I was only going to drink 2 drinks, and 5 drinks in, I'd be like, oh my God, how did that happen? So she had me like dead to rights. And at that point, all of the phrases in the book that talk about how we're different than other people, right? How we're affected differently by alcohol than people who are not like us. All of a sudden, it all made sense. Yeah. And it was sort of like a conversion experience. It was one of those, okay, now into my innermost self, no one has to tell me. I really get that I'm an alcoholic and why. Yeah. And my life was qualitatively different from that point on. So yes, I can say that I was kind of white knuckling it until then. And not that life has been a bowl of cherries in the last, 26 years since then. But I've had no question about the fact that I am alcoholic and that there's nothing in my life that will be made better if I take a drink. Mm-hmm. And that's, in a nutshell, how I define my sobriety.
Interesting. Very, very, very helpful. Very helpful. Because it also brings me to this next area I want to explore with you. And I think that this can be a challenge, at least I've heard it so far be a challenge for some people who come into recovery, where they say, if I've had issues with substances, there's no way I could do psychedelics because I'm built differently. And, I will always be putting myself at risk if I expose myself to a substance. I think one of the questions I have for you around that is, can addicts and alcoholics actually recover? In other words, no longer use substances addictively. And I find that, my story is a bit different than yours in that I came into recovery and was very, very active in it for about a decade. And over time, I ultimately found myself to a place of release around addiction and alcohol. I did not find myself to be at a place where I could not drink. Now, interestingly, I simply decided I was no longer interested in drinking, but I also felt, I don't want to say like sort of a lack of resonance, because that's not true. I don't want to say that, I graduated, because that's not true either. But I did feel some sort of elevation or forward movement where I no longer felt I was needing to manage my alcoholism through recovery. And ultimately, I moved on from 12-step. I no longer went to 12-step. And I've not gone back to, engaging substances with any sort of challenge or difficulty. And most people know me as someone who doesn't use any substances, who doesn't drink, etc. So I find resonance with this notion of substance abuse disorder, which seems to leave at least more room conceptually for substance use without abuse. But I do wonder, how other folks think about this, and I'm very curious to make some space for your thoughts around, for those of us who get to a place where we are no longer actively participating in 12-step, and we, may or may not engage with substances. Are we, deluding ourselves, or what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I have a bunch. I participate now in another 12-step recovery group called Psychedelics in Recovery. And so we're all people who are from different 12-step fellowships who are consciously engaging with psychedelic medicine to assist a spiritual development, a spiritual path. So we're squarely in that category of people of which you speak. To me, my experience all the way through is that it's very, very important. I'm a big advocate of a sobriety date, right? I think it's important to know your sobriety date because it gives you something to hold as valuable. But how you define your sobriety is entirely up to you. It's usually helpful to have help, but ultimately it's up to you. And my experience has been up until now, and then with the discovery of PIR, that it's super important. I'll use the example of a friend of mine that I have. I have a friend who went to rehab like 3-something years ago, the abstinent kind of rehab, right? Like that preaches 100% abstinence is the only thing that qualifies as sobriety. Mm-hmm. And she has in fact been abstinent from alcohol since then. She has an anxiety that's been incredibly difficult to treat. And cannabis works as a treatment for her for that anxiety. But of course, she's freewheeling it because nobody's prescribing cannabis for anxiety, right? Mm-hmm. Now, her drugs of choice are cocaine and ecstasy. And those are the drugs that she feels badly about. She doesn't like how she is. She doesn't like what happens. And she feels badly after she's done. And she wishes that she didn't do those. Putting down alcohol wasn't that hard for her, but this other thing is challenging. But here's where the connection is. We talked about cannabis use, right? She uses it medically, but she also uses it recreationally. But she's really thinking about, how do I know I'm sober? I said, can you put down the recreational use? She said, yes, I can. I said, so here's the deal. You don't drink. You use cannabis to treat your anxiety. You don't use it recreationally, and you put down the stuff that bothers you. And as long as you're doing that, you are sober to you. So that's that aspect of it. The other aspect of it is when Alcoholics Anonymous came into existence, there were some people in some places that had some meetings. They figured out this process that happens in the 12 steps, and they wrote a book about it, right? People started, the Saturday Evening Post article came out, and people started writing from all over the world. Oh my God, I need this book. This is what's wrong with me. I need help. So, I always use the example of Alaska. So they would ship the book out, and this lone person in Alaska who knew they had this problem, didn't know another soul who had it, sat down with the book and put themselves through the work and got and stayed sober, right? Like the 12-step fellowship that's grown up in all the years since then is beautiful for all the things that it's beautiful for, but it's not recovery. It's not sobriety, and it doesn't define it. Right? Sobriety is this process that you go through that's governed by the 12 steps. It's an internalized spiritual process. AA is not the only place that it comes from, but it's particularly applicable to someone like me because I have a few peculiar bends in the way I'm wired, right? So this is my to spiritual truisms. Like it's a spiritual truism that if I'm upset with something out here, I'm the one who's disturbed, right? AA didn't make that up, right? That's like an axiom in the world, right? But AA gave me a way how to understand it and how to be able to handle it responsibly and in a way that leaves me healthy, right? So you can go all the way through to, you can work all the steps, and then as a result of that experience, you have a spiritual awakening, and then you're only charged with going forward and helping others as a means of holding on to what you got. You don't need AA for that, right? Yeah. So people do graduate from AA. Do I think I graduate from this physiological condition known as alcoholism? No, I don't think it's true for me that I could take alcohol safely. My experience up until the age of 29 abundantly proved that to me. And 27 years of sitting in rooms and listening to women like myself go back out and come back and talk about what happened when they picked up again. And the phenomenon is the same across so many women that I feel safe to say that for me, that's not a chance I want to take. It's not a place I need to go, because there's probably a lot of truth to the fact that I am different enough that I can't pick up alcohol safely. I also choose not to pick up cocaine, and I choose not to pick up opiates because there was never really anything sane for me about the way I used those substances. And then there's what I'm doing with psychedelics, right? And I have people in this PIR fellowship that I check in with. I've done some MDMA therapy with my partner. And I also started using CBD for sleep, right? And the first time I took the CBD, I got a little like what I think that I would have liked pot to feel like. Pot just like hits me over the head and I feel awful and that's it. So for me, there's no attraction to THC.
Yeah, it's not fun. It's just not fun. It's not fun. And maybe, you know, there could be a whole bunch of reasons for this. Maybe I had bad pot. Maybe I had bad friends. Maybe I just had a bad day. Like, I don't know, but sorry, I caught you when you're just about to swallow there. I just want to make sure you're going to make it through.
Okay. No, that's,
but yeah, but it really, I was actually talking on the podcast with someone else about how it just literally made me stoned. Like, I was just immobile, right? It was just not an interesting experience. But CBN, that has been phenomenal for me. I was actually just at the shop before getting on this conversation with you, trying to, like, I got to top up, right? So it's really, really useful for working pains through my body, you know, settling my sleep. It's so helpful.
Yeah. So the first time I stayed awake for it, I'm one of those people that always feels like there's something I could be or should be doing, right? I still have that, right? Like, if I'm awake, there's probably something I could be attending to. And so the CBD I got is, I have a chemist friend. He's brilliant. And so I told him what I was experiencing, and he made me a CBD liquid that I could bake with. So I bake brownies, right? So I ate the brownie, but I wasn't ready to go to bed. And so I sat on my sofa, and then I thought, and I put on Netflix and I watched an episode of a show I'd never watched before. And I thought, oh, that's kind of cool. And then as I'm sitting on the sofa, I'm thinking, well, weren't these things I was going to do? And I'm like, I don't really feel like doing them. And I sat there and I watched another episode, and I'm like, this feels kind of good. I'm not going to do anything, and I don't have to. And I sat there and I was like, this is kind of like what I think people who like pot feel like, right? It's like, it's manageable, but it feels good. You feel kind of like, whatever. Like, yeah. But then the next day I was like, oh my God, if I did it again, it would mean I wasn't sober, blah, blah, blah. So I called my friend in PIR and I explained what happened. And he says, you know, Kat, there's no law against feeling good. And I was like, yeah. And he goes, so are you obsessing about it? Are you thinking about the next time you're going to do it? Are you making up excuses in your head why you should do it again? I'm like, yeah, no. He's like, well, I'd watch for those things, but the just feeling good part, yeah, there's no problem there.
Yeah. That's,
you know, so that's the advice that we give each other there, right? It's like, and in the times I mostly do it, what I find now when I take the brownie, if I don't have enough hours to sleep, I wake up kind of dopey a little bit, and I don't like that feeling. So I only take it if I haven't been sleeping and I have some hours to sleep, that's when I take it.
I'm right there with you.
And so his advice was sound. It's like, if you have an addictive response to something, then you need to look at that as an addictive problem. But the compounds themselves are not necessarily the issue. It's our response to them. And no one is the same.
Yeah. That's really helpful to hear. And, you know, we're talking about it already, so we can dive into it a little bit more, but I just want to come back and summarize something I heard you say that I thought was really, really important. It's about sort of the conscious engagement with a substance versus the unconscious and unmanageable engagement with a substance. That's really the differentiator I hear you making here.
Yeah, we call it the difference between intentional use and recreational use.
Yeah.
Right. Most of us on this more conservative side don't really endorse recreational use for its own sake, right? Just for the sake of it. I don't take acid and go hang out with my friends, or I don't do those kinds of things, right? So I am careful about my intention behind what I'm taking, when I'm taking it, what am I taking it for? I've done some work with MDMA with my partner, and people, you know, you'll hear people say, like, people who did raves. I mean, raves started after I stopped, right? So like,
Yeah.
I never
Same
did,
here.
I never went to a rave, like none of that's in my experience, right?
Yeah.
But I had a relationship that really got into a rough spot, and this has a very unique way of opening you up inside and quelling anxious voices, so it can create a level of intimacy and sharing that is maybe harder to get to. And so based on that research and my feelings about where I was at with my partner and what I needed for myself, I was willing to try it. And I can see, I mean, it engenders really good feelings. I mean, I can see why people would get addicted to it or want to do it all the time. So I stay conscious about my choice of when I use it, how I use it, and in what way. And I think that helps make a difference between, you need to know why you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah. And I also think too, at least for me, I had this experience, and I wonder if you've ever had this experience. I also, when I use and engage substances consciously, I find that the substances also tell me what I need to know about my use. So my journey work in psychedelics started with MDMA. I did 3 MDMA journeys. Each journey, it was progressively more challenging to recover from the MDMA use, so that by the 3rd journey, everything in my system was telling me, we're all done with this. You do this again, now you're inviting trouble. But we're telling you, we're all done with this. Like, we don't need to do this anymore for a while, right? So don't come back to this one. Don't come back. And I was like, okay. So, fast forward about a year, I was doing some work with my therapist and guide, and I had come to know about 5-MeO DMT and said, I want to explore this work. Like, this feels like a really useful next evolutionary step for me. And my guide spoke with their mentor, and the mentor suggested, because I hadn't done 5-MeO before, and it's a pretty intense consciousness experience, that I do that with some MDMA. And I was like, nope. I'm not doing it. I'm not going back to MDMA. Like, everything in me tells me I don't need to go back there anymore. So we stood firm, and the mentor allowed for me to go ahead and do the 5-MeO. And it worked out just great. It turned out to be a catapulting experience for me. So I do think that, engaging these substances consciously, your consciousness and the substances start to like communicate with each other. I know that might sound like super hippy dippy, especially to folks who are like, look, I'm just trying not to, drink alcohol all the time. But I do think that there's some developing sort of a conscious engagement with substances. I think, for me, at least, I can hear when a substance is going to be useful for me. And then I can hear, you need to leave that alone now. I don't know. Do you have this? What do you think? Am I just like off my psychedelic rocker?
I totally agree. And most everybody I know has the same relationships to substances. But what came to me at the end of what you were sharing is a lot of all of the journey is about conscious understanding, conscious intuitive understanding, right? Like, if we listen, we get everything we need about psychedelics or anything. It's just we don't listen, right? Like, the medicine speaks, absolutely. I mean, the primary medicine I've worked with is psilocybin. And from the minute I started with it, it speaks and I listen, right? Including when to microdose, when not to microdose, macrodoses.
I want to jump in because I'm excited. I want to share the story about microdosing and macrodosing. So after MDMA, my next medicine was psilocybin. And so I hadn't had a psilocybin journey yet. And I had to go back into a situation. I had taken a 3-month leave from work, and I had to go back and during that 3-month leave, I started psychedelics work. And so I had to go back to work, and this was a pretty toxic workplace. It was my last toxic, I'm going to fix it relationship. Right. So a lot of lessons learned. It wasn't an accident. So I had to go back to work, and my therapist had said, I think you might want to consider microdosing psilocybin as you enter back into this space that, has been very mentally challenging, very challenging to your mental health. I think you might want to consider microdosing. And I was like, no, I'm fine. I've done these MDMA journeys, and I'm open and I'm feeling steady and I'm feeling grounded. It's going to be fine. We'll get to the psilocybin, it's going to be okay. She was like, okay. So I go back to work. It is April 1st. My first meeting at 8:30 in the morning just jumps off with some BS, girl. I mean, just straight toxic crazy right from jump. By Wednesday, when I had my next therapy session, I walked into my therapist's office. I was like, you got to microdose me. No, wait a minute. You got to macrodose. You got whatever dose you want to give me. Just give it to me right now. Like, I will do whatever you want me to do because I'm about to kill up some folks and I just had 3 MDMA journeys, right? So please dose me. So yeah, it is very interesting. You said that, the medicine speaks and we don't want to listen. I said, what is that about? Like, why are we so hard-headed?
No, but I mean, anything speaks. I mean, the process of recovery, psychedelics aside, for me, is about getting me in touch with the small, still voice. Like it says in the book, the concept of God exists inside every man, woman, and child. Like the universe speaks to me, not here, but right here. Right here.
Yeah,
right?
Right in the core.
In that very still small way. One of the things that like I've read it in different ways, but it's like there's a part about one of the stories in the book that talks about suddenly the man had this crazy notion that if he had the whiskey with milk, blah blah blah, smallly, like quietly, he has the thought that maybe that's not such a great idea. Right? Like all of the craziness happens suddenly and it's all this big clangy stuff in my head. The proper spiritual thing to do always comes as a small, still voice. And it always says, how about this? You don't have to. It just says, what about this?
Yeah.
And if you say no now, it just sits back for a little while. It says, you go on, see how that works for you. And then when you hit another wall, the voice says, how about this?
Yeah.
Oh, no. Okay. And then you go on for a while. And each wall you hit is usually a little bit thicker, a little bit harder, a little bit worse. But the voice still says, how about this?
How about this?
Right?
How about this?
No matter what ideas you've going on in your head about how great everything's going to be, and I'm going to do that, that's just all busy chatter in your head, right? Yeah. And again, I'm putting like AA language around spiritual truisms that you can find almost in any walk of spiritual life, right? The small, still voice is there. And what we need to do is cultivate our ability to hear it and trust it and go with it, right? And psychedelics in some ways are like a cut through. They're like, they have the way to patch me into what that is. I get access to things through psychedelics that it just would take way longer otherwise to do.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's interesting too, to me that, I mean, when I was coming up in 12-step, I never once ever heard about Bill Wilson doing psychedelics. And yet, like, there it is now, right? Yeah. Like, I've discovered so much around that. And I completely agree that it is that nurturing. For me, psychedelics is that nurturing of the small, still voice. So it's not so small. It's not so still anymore, right? I think the clamor of the world makes it small and still. And psychedelics really gives that voice a fullness now and a bigness that it didn't have before.
Yeah. I do think, though, in some ways that, like, one of the traps about all of this intensity now, all of this interest in psychedelics, right? Because like the research is coming out and people are getting more interested in it, and there's decriminalization going on. There's like this, I'd call it a renaissance, except for it's new, right? Like it didn't have this level of attention and widespread interest, even when they were doing research on it in the 60s. But my experience with the medicine is that it doesn't really do anything more than point you in the direction of where you need to look. Right? It doesn't do it for you. It doesn't fix anything. It doesn't make you better. It simply points up what it is that there is for you to do, helps point the direction, but it's still incumbent upon you to do the work. It doesn't do the work for me. It just shows me what I have to do. Right? Yeah. Like my mother died when I was a kid, and until a year ago, I could never bring up the subject without crying. And I would say to people, I've had a long time to get used to this. When is this ever going to stop? Right? And I mean, and I'm one of those people who told my story regularly. I know my story, right? So my very first psilocybin journey, I take it and I'm thinking, okay, whatever, you know, half an hour, 45 minutes goes by. I go to the bathroom. The floor looks like it's shimmering maybe a little bit. I'm not having visuals. I'm not having any of that stuff, right? And my partner was here with me who knows my story. And I walked back from the bathroom to the bed where I was. And literally like that, I was 11. They just told me my mother died. And when I tell you I cried, like this was crying. This was like the grief that I hadn't done in 40 years, right? Snot flying, pillow punching, like, you know, that coupled with the awareness, what I said in this childlike place was, there was a piece of my mother passing that what came after that was everyone else got over it very quickly and I didn't. So not only was there that, but then there was this experience over the next several years of being in this grief and having everybody look at me like, oh dear, aren't you over that yet? Everything's okay. What's the matter with you? Right.
Yeah. So not having any space for the deepest separation you could have possibly experienced.
Right. With that experience of being that age saying, but don't you understand the worst thing in the world has happened to me?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, and nobody, so like he very, very kindly just said, oh, you absolutely should feel the way you're feeling. And I was really in that, the grief of that, the grief behind just being so bereft and having no support around it, you know?
Yeah.
And I'm having this conversation with you and I haven't shed a tear. Like this whole issue has been qualitatively changed since that trip. I could have spent the next 10 more years in therapy talking about it and not achieved access to the grief that I hadn't felt in 40 years.
Yep.
Psilocybin just opened the door and out it came.
And out it came. Yep.
And I've been told ever since.
Yeah. You know, one of the things I'm super curious about too is, you know, as I listen to you talk about some of the profound experiences you've had with psychedelics, how did you come to know, especially as a person in recovery, how did you come to know essentially you should do drugs?
The partner that I have now, I've been with for about 3 years. And these are substances that he has experience with. And he was in a period of time where he was like sharing these experiences with other people. And I've been in several relationships, even in sobriety. And in my last relationship, I had a house full of alcohol. Being around substances don't bother me. The only thing that has ever bothered me is being around drinking drunks. That's about the only category of thing in the world that I accept myself from, right? I give myself permission to not have to be terribly close to drinking drunks. But alcohol itself is not a problem for me. And normal people drinking doesn't bother me in the least, right? Yeah. So they were doing these, I'd never even done these substances. I didn't know anything about them. They were doing them in front of me or around me or whatever, and I didn't care. But as I don't exactly know. There's been some life circumstances for me over the last year and a half. Not the least of which was the identification of CPTSD as a defining thing for me. Like I've always had symptoms of PTSD, but I haven't been raped and I haven't gone to war and I haven't done all the things for which PTSD is attributed, right? But I've had symptoms. And so I was doing some looking around online and stuff and found someone talking about CPTSD and what was it and and I was like, oh my God, like that makes everything make sense. And so
I want to jump in here for just a minute because I too, that is actually what brought me to psychedelics was a complex PTSD diagnosis. And for folks who are not familiar with complex PTSD, it's all the fun of PTSD, the hypervigilance and the notion that the world is unsafe and you are unsafe in the world, compounded with a set of behaviors that make it very hard to function in the world. I will post in the show notes a link to that. I actually just finished doing some writing about this very thing and sort of how I was walked into my complex PTSD diagnosis. And like you, didn't have any resonance of being a war veteran or, all of sort of the typical ways that PTSD had been talked about, at least when I was coming up and coming into recovery. Now I think it's being talked about in many, many different ways. But, I had sat in, 20 plus years of therapy with therapists who had heard the particulars of my very harrowing story and had never said, hey, maybe you have PTSD. Like just nobody talked about that. Right. So I completely just resonate with you is sort of just having this discovery kind of late in life, like, oh, there's this thing. Oh, I am not sitting on a couch for 10 years with this thing. Like life, like it has taken, all this work that I have done to get to a life that I want to live. And now I'm going to spend it on a couch for 10 years with complex PTSD. No. There has got to be something. So I completely am there with you in terms of the similarity in story.
Well, I found books, one book in particular, and when I give you the references you asked me for earlier, I'll give you the reference to that too, that I actually ended up using as a self-therapy tool. Mm-hmm. And I dragged a couple people with me. I started a book study around this book with a couple of women and who also identify as having CPTSD, and did the work myself, mm-hmm. on myself, with myself. Now, I don't recommend that to everybody.
Yeah, how come you didn't go? So firstly, what's the name of the book and why didn't you go get a therapist?
Okay, so the book is called CPTSD From Surviving to Thriving by Pete Walker.
Okay.
And unlike some of the other CPTS books out there that talk about like the somatic and the brain and blah, 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 he talks about all of it as a large interconnected set of phenomenon, right? Like, mm-hmm. yes, our brains put those memories away in a not, prefrontal cerebral cortex location. Yes, we do have a fight or flight response that when it's triggered, we're not here anymore and we're somewhere mm-hmm. else. Yes, we all the things that we do, but we do it in this bigger picture of what happens, right? And there's exercises in the book and there's ways of looking at things in the book that can help you cope and help you find your way out of triggered places, right? Mm-hmm. So that you're triggered less often around less things, right? Which is essentially the recovery from this is to stop being triggered. Like a trigger is capital T trigger, and I'll define that just for the sake of it, mm-hmm. is when something happens now and all of a sudden I have a problem, right? And the only way I know of identifying the problem is what's happening now that's my problem. And it's usually you, whoever the you is in the moment. Mm-hmm. And I'm usually scurrying around trying to figure out what it was you just did or said, what it did, right? This is this hypervigilance. The truth is it's a trigger. The problem isn't from now. Only I don't know that when I'm in it, right? I don't know that when that's happening. So there's this whole set of phenomenon about what does it mean to be triggered? Where are you? What's happening? And my earliest attention was put on this when I had a therapist that used to say, to use the phrase, that was then, this is now.
Yeah.
Right? If you say something to me and what you say to me is maybe aggravating to this degree, but I get angry to this degree, mm-hmm. like this is the now part and this is the then part. Exactly. You look like what you do is you represent to me wherever the cause was for this. And the cause is not now. The cause is when I was a child, when I was in a bad relationship, wherever it is, it's not here and now.
It's not now. Yeah.
And it's not you.
Yeah. And I think for me too, like the word trigger has been, I think at this point now, it has such a maligned reputation. It's dismissed, I think, a lot. So I actually stopped using,
it's because to me, there's a capital T and a little t, and the little
fair.
T is what's been abused.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. I've actually stopped using it altogether though. I replace it with landmine. So for me, they're like, because it really, I imagine like, this, I've taken some trips to Africa, and I remember when I went to Angola, there was a place that we went to, a village that we went to, where kids were not allowed to go play out like in the surrounding area of the village because it was still filled with landmines. And so there was all this beautiful country that they could not go in because things would explode. That was very much what it could be like to be in relationship with me. Like you can't go to those places because things just might explode. And what I've been doing is diffusing the landmines, just making it so that just pulling the pen out of them so they don't work. Like that's been the work with psychedelics. So yeah, just very much resonate with sort of that response. And it's interesting too, because what I hope is that people who might hear this might actually then maybe start to recognize that in themselves, or maybe even more importantly, recognize it in other people, right? Like, my wife got to a point where she would be like, okay, what's happening to you right now? That doesn't have that's not me. So you go do what you need to do, take care of yourself. And when you're ready, you can come back and engage with me. But I am not going to absorb what you're doing right now as being about me, because there's just no way that the level of response you're having
Mm-hmm.
is representative of what's just happened here. Right. So just being able to recognize that.
That's a very grown-up version of what I got. My current partner said, you know what, this trigger thing isn't working for me anymore.
Whatever works, man. I mean, whatever works. Absolutely.
Yeah, he didn't have all that language to put for it, but it's the same phenomenon. Like,
well, that's $10,000 worth of marriage therapy, Kat. Like, that's what that is. So
fair enough, right? Like, no, but it was like, what I realized is as I came out the other side of it, because I got lost in it. I got into it and I was working so hard at it that I literally lost track of today altogether. Right. And so I had sort of taken a couple people hostage behind this work that I was doing. And in particular, I was using him as a punching bag emotionally. And none of that was right. Like, none of my past trauma justifies behaving like that in the present. Right. Yeah. So fortunately, I had got enough of it done that when I had to put it down, I put it down. That when I say put it down, I mean the intense working on it. I put down working on it, but I was in a much better place than when I had started. Right. When I started, I would be triggered, or I would have a trauma response, whatever language you want to use for it. And literally I would go from being like in the present and okay to wherever it would whisk me away to, unbeknownst to me, from 0 to 100 with nothing to intervene. And I would be in a place where I was hopelessly lost, hopelessly incapable of mediating my responses. And I would just be stuck. Right. And people around me would be stuck with whatever they got. Like, oh, there she goes. Like, oh, no, there's Kat. And she's inconsolable in the corner. She's apoplectic or whatever the hell she is now. And I'm at a point now where there's much more insight. There's much more manageability. I don't say that it doesn't happen, but it's nothing like what it was. Yeah. And you've been
engaged with psychedelics for like a couple of years now, or so? How long ago does this start?
I'd say it's coming up on a year.
Okay.
Right. And I haven't necessarily been using the psychedelics directly in conjunction with this. Right. I was doing this on my own, and I had made a couple attempts in recent time to get into therapy. And some of it, I did a lot of intense therapy in my early sobriety. I think I had an 8-year run with one therapist who was great. And then, she and her wife had a kid, and they decided they wanted to raise her in New Zealand and not in America. So she left. And so I never really got another therapist after that. And then, I became aware of the fact that I could use some therapy, but there were some like insurance issues, payment issues, that kind of thing. Right. And so when
welcome to mental health care in America, man.
Right. And so I did a big crash and burn in the fall. And then I was like, okay, I have to get a therapist, because what I recognized was therapy was going to be the only way to continue to deal with being triggered and my issues around trauma without taking it out on the people I care about. What I needed to do was have that, therapy is like a container. It's like a safe space if it's done properly, and in my humble opinion. And so what I needed was that, right? Yeah. Someplace where I knew I would go with that stuff, because I wasn't going to go to the people I cared about with it anymore. Right. Yep. So suddenly therapy had a very specific purpose for me, and I became willing to engage with it again. Right. Yeah. And so in the place where I had a bad therapy experience, blah, 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 I got another therapist. He's terrific. And I mean, I'm grateful to be in the therapy, but I continue to get better at handling this and dealing with this. And it's a gestalt, right? It's recovery, it's sobriety, it's the introduction of psychedelic medicine. It's this newfound 12-step support I'm getting through psychedelics in recovery, which has sort of reinvigorated my sense of community service. In the tradition of a 12-step fellowship of service, I find myself now wanting to support this organization, because I have so much 12-step experience, help put it in a direction like they did in the early days of AA. Like all they did was try to keep themselves from imploding. Right. And so this organization stands on the precipice of, are we going to do really well here? Or are we just going to shoot ourselves in the feet? And that'll be that. So I have this vested interest now in helping them, grow and develop. And, so it's this whole package. It's my partner sticking with me through it. It's the experience of our life in general and the people around us. And yes, psychedelics are a part of that.
Yeah. And I also, you were mentioning the various aspects, right? It's your own work, your own therapy, your own engagement with psychedelics, your engagement with your partner, your engagement in psychedelics and recovery. I think you have an organization that you're working on with your partner, with another friend or another
Yes.
colleague, correct? Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because it seems like that's also a place where sort of all of these ways of healing are coming together for you.
Yes, yes, they are. And because of the success that we've had personally with psychedelic use, both of my partners and I, we started an organization called the Spiritual. It's SSDCE, and I always trip over the word, even though I wrote them. Right? It's called the Sanctuary for Spiritual Development and Consciousness Expansion. And the reason for all of those parts are sanctuary for all of the English language reason of it is one thing, but for the other more meat and potato reason is we hope to find a space someday to have as a true sanctuary. Spiritual development is what all of us work on. Everyone in my tribe. I'm part of a leather family. I have a chosen family, and everybody that's around me, we're all dedicated to our own spiritual development and to the support of each other's, right?
Mm-hmm.
Through all these different modalities, through therapy, through kink, through awareness, through working on ourselves, deep introspection. There's a whole other side.
Psychedelics.
Psychedelics. Well, psychedelics is the newest addition to this body of work that we're doing. It's the psychedelics that catalyzed our desire to take what we do and bring it forward. We have another group called the Kink Collective, which is our leather family, and also it's predicated on a philosophy called People Before Kink. And part of what we do with that is a lot of deep introspective work. As I'm sure you're aware, if you're anywhere outside of a heteronormative vanilla box, you have to do some things in order to function in the world. You have to get real with yourself about some things that like you didn't learn at home, like that we didn't learn on TV, like how to be gay or queer or leather or dominant or submissive. You don't learn any of this stuff, right? So when you find yourself, oh my God, I'm a man and I want to wear pantyhose. I'm a woman and I love other women. Like all of a sudden you have this crisis that forces you to have to look at some stuff. And we're not even taught how to do that. Right. So most of us have had to do this journey alone, or, maybe we're lucky enough to find a friend or someone else who, even better, you find someone who can relate. But there's no way in how to do that. So we've been doing that work with people for some time now without the psychedelic addition. And so, psychedelics creates this very powerful platform from which to launch all the rest of this stuff. So the consciousness expansion part of SSDCE is the addition of psychedelics to this work we were already doing.
Gotcha.
Right.
Okay.
So
Gotcha.
That's our dream. Our dream is to have a place where we can continue to work with people on spiritual development with the addition of the consciousness expansion that comes from the use of psychedelics.
Gotcha. All right. I want to shift direction here a little bit. I have just been dying to talk to somebody in recovery about this topic. As I've come into psychedelics advocacy and have started to research and read more, I came into this body of work or thought about addiction as a disease, and that addiction is not a disease. And there's sort of this conversation around addiction is not a disease. To frame it as a disease is doing people a disservice. It is keeping them from healing. And, this is incredibly problematic, and we need to focus on this and we need to change it. And, when you and I were doing prep, I mentioned that I am so glad that I'm not getting sober for the first time right now, because it would be so confusing to manage. It just seems like there's so much extreme conversation and so little kind of holistic focus or nuance. Because to me, like, regardless of the inputs, whether it's genetic predisposition, whether it's physiological demand, whether it's developmental conditioning, the output was that my brain was wired for self-destruction. My spirit was sending up this message: hey, we don't want to be here anymore. This place is awful, and humanity is awful, and we're not interested in this anymore. And my brain was receiving that message and saying, okay, let's self-destroy. Let's get out of here. And recovery for me included the notion of addiction as a disease in my head, but that didn't limit me to any kind of single solution, because the messaging I was also getting was, that precisely because it was an issue with my wiring, I could rewire myself if I came from several angles. If I stopped putting certain chemicals in my body, if I changed how I ate and exercised and slept, if I changed who I kept company with, if I changed what I consumed intellectually. Like, I remember I was talking to someone in recovery about this book I was reading that was making me feel really awful. And the person said, so maybe you shouldn't put that kind of feeling in your brain. Like maybe you should, watch what you expose your feelings to, what kind of music, what kind of books, what kind of movies. Like just changing what I prioritized in my life, prioritizing service instead of self, learning from other people how to cope. If I had not had this notion that I could rewire my brain, if I had just considered this like this is just a developmental affliction, I think my approach would have been too narrow. Like my approach to recovery just would have been too narrow. So I don't know. I'm not quite sure. So what this addiction is a disease or isn't a disease. Like, I'm not quite sure what this argument is about now. Like maybe it's about the tool set is too narrow, but I wonder if like having this argument is actually like helping, like sort of helping the cause. So I'm just curious if anything comes to mind for you.
I'm not sure which side of the argument you're on for the concept of disease. I'm not even exactly sure, because I think there are different issues when it comes to chemicals, right? There's different issues around different chemicals.
Yeah, I don't find myself on one side of the argument or the other. I just don't understand why are we focused on having that argument? Like and what I'm saying is, like, for me, if I had been coming into recovery now, I think that argument would have made a lot more confusion for me if I had come into recovery now.
That argument was around when I got sober, right? Talking about it as a disease. And I think, as I've always done, if I can't get my head wrapped around something, I kind of ignore it. And I never did really get clear about the whole idea of a disease, except to say that I have the physical allergy coupled with the mental craving that they talk about for alcohol. Mm-hmm. Right. So to the degree that one wanted to call that a disease, I just use that as a euphemistic phrase for being alcoholic.
And the physical allergy coupled with the mental craving, I think that's pretty straightforward.
In terms of the use of the word disease, or no?
Well, I think like in terms of just sort of understanding yourself, right?
Yeah.
Like, not necessarily getting caught up in like whether it's a disease or not a disease, but just like very clearly saying, right, I have this physical allergy coupled with this mental craving.
Which I got out of those first 4 chapters at 18 months. And I did that work, and it was like, it's a very simple explanation for me, right? Yeah. They've done other research that proves that like our liver enzymes are different than other people. I mean, there's other even like biological factors that seem to want to go into the argument that alcoholics are different, bodily and mentally different than our fellows, as the language goes, right? Is that true for everyone that takes and has trouble with drugs? I don't know. And what I do know is I can't speak for them, right? Mm-hmm. Like, this is an intensely personal journey that everyone needs to have self-responsibility for, to walk through, right? There's a Vice article that just came out, and I'll send you the link to that as well. 3 of the members of my fellowship were interviewed for it because it's talking about the use of psychedelics in recovery. The article is about that exactly, and about some of the more restrictive models that are out there. And in 2 of the stories, these were people who used heavier narcotics, meth and heroin and whatnot, that got to the end of their line. And then Ibogaine in particular was held out there as a possible thing to try. And in both of their cases, they went and did Ibogaine treatments and were able to have recovery around those chemicals for which their lives were being destroyed. So, so then the question simply becomes, what does a person do, right? If you're one of those people who are using meth, without seeming option every day because you can't get yourself to stop, what will help you stop? Well, ultimately it's whatever helps you stop. So whether it's Ibogaine treatment and then a renewed interest in 12-step recovery, or rational recovery where you engage in recovery without reference to a God, or whatever it is, if it's a chemical that abstinence from is pretty much the only way to really roll, then whatever helps you to get to that abstinence, I'm all for, right? Mm-hmm. If what you're struggling with, and in my time since then, I've been with people who drank or used the way I did when I drank and used, But then, like they talk about in the book, they were one of those people, when given sufficient reason, could stop or alter how they were using, right? So I've seen people who drank and used worse than me, who now like have a glass of wine and then maybe order another one and don't finish it. For the life of me, I will never, ever understand that. There's not a cell in this body that understands that. But I've seen it around me. And I recognize that. So to say when those people were drinking, to say that they had a disease would just have been wrong. They were just in a period of their lives where they were like drinking and using like crazy people, right? Like worse than me even. So it's not for anybody else to decide or to define. And I think language is only as helpful as it affects the changes that we need to make for ourselves.
That is helpful to hear. Yeah, that's helpful to hear. And I appreciate that kind of conversation because I haven't read that conversation yet, right? I've read kind of very extreme views on this. So yeah, that's very interesting to hear.
Well, maybe I should read it somewhere so people can read it.
Yes. I think that would be a great idea. So, you'll have this conversation and it'll go back and take some notes for yourself. But yeah, I would appreciate that. And it was interesting too, because your response to me was like, I'm not sure what side of the issue you're on. Right. And I was like, but that's exactly the point. Like, how about we just write where no one's on any side of the issue and we just actually have some thoughtful conversation about this.
Because as you can tell from what I'm saying, I don't have sides of anything that I'm really on, except for the side that is in the person's inherent best interest. The point that I was getting at with my friend earlier, because of the use of cannabis for her to help her with her anxiety, she never feels like she deserves to say she's sober. Right. And I have not yet been able to get her to hold on to a sobriety date, an idea of what the definition is for her to be sober. She just always goes back to, well, in that treatment center, they told me that if I wasn't abstinent, I wasn't sober. And I can't get her to redefine it. And so consequently, when she runs into another group of people that are holding on to some cocaine and ecstasy and all that business, she doesn't have any reason to tell herself why not.
Yeah, because I'm not sober anyway. So
I'm not sober anyway, right? And so then she goes through another weekend of using in a way she doesn't really want to, and then comes out the other side remorseful and disappointed in herself and wondering what it's going to take for her to not do that again. And whatever you want to say about cocaine and ecstasy, they're not helpful for her because she doesn't want to do it. She's not doing it in a way that's healthy for her, and she does it in a way that makes her feel bad about herself. So I would argue that for her, it's not a good idea. And if there was a way to be able to be abstinent for her around the chemicals that don't make her feel good about herself, then whatever would do that, I'm all for.
Exactly. Like just having some clarity, like here is where my life is unmanaged and here is actually where my life is supported.
Right.
Right. And we can actually distinguish those kinds of substance uses.
Yes.
Yeah. I think the last thing I'll ask you, Kat, is, and I think we're speaking to that right now, sort of how do we better support people with substance abuse issues in psychedelics so that they have access to this healing? Like, how do we better support people who may come from substance abuse issues with thinking about psychedelics so that they can actually have access? And you've kind of spoken to that a little bit with the example of your friend. Like, it sounds like one thing is just helping to clarify for people and helping them think maybe with a little more nuance and a little less extremeness about what it means to be sober and how you actually do have not just the power, but the responsibility to define sobriety for yourself and not let someone define that for you, because their experience may not really reflect your needs and your experience. So that seems like the first one is just helping empower.
My experience can't be like yours.
Yeah.
All our experiences are different.
Yeah. So it sounds like one of the first ways that we can better support people with a history of substance abuse issues is empowering them to really find their own definition of sobriety and whatever is needed to support that conscious engagement with themselves. They can make some space for that. Anything else that comes to mind for how to better support people with substance abuse issues? They want access to psychedelic healing. How do we support them with that?
Make it legal.
I knew you were going to say that. I could hear it. I could absolutely. Yeah.
There's no other way around it. Like how can I support you? I can support you if you're in recovery and you want to work with psychedelics, but I can't legally. And there's a million of me out there.
Yeah.
right? There's a million of us who are having personal experiences with psychedelics that are life-changing, right? And there's people like me who understand recovery. The ability to synthesize all of that and help people is tremendous. We just can't for fear of ending up in jail, right? There's a limit to how much out on a limb I'm willing to go because I like not being in jail,
Yeah.
right?
It's pretty cool.
Like life, right? And so
Yeah.
as much as I want to help people, and I sincerely do, we shouldn't have to operate in the shadows. We shouldn't have to operate like criminals, right? So whether you're in recovery or you're struggling in any other way in your life, and access to psychedelics is what will help you, then access is a legal issue.
Yeah. Agreed. So having that, if you want to advocate for psychedelics and psychedelic healing, you have to advocate for the legality of psychedelics. You have to.
What do they say? Call your senator. However that is. I don't know much about that stuff because I've never been a big activist in that level. I mean, in the world of terms of activism. So I don't really know. I know that we all cheer every time another place decriminalizes.
Yeah.
You know, we're all ecstatic because it all feels like, I feel like psychedelics are right behind cannabis in terms of like what happens with cannabis will be happening with psychedelics. But it's a journey. It's not even a journey. It's an uphill battle. And, the good news is psychedelic experience speaks for itself. Like people who have seen medical marijuana. If you've been around a woman dying of cancer at 80 years old who can't hold down her breakfast for the nausea from the chemo, and you watch her, having never done any of this stuff for any of her life, take a little bit of cannabis and calm down and be able to hold breakfast down and to be able to go through her day with some degree of dignity. Like, you can't not support that, right? Psychedelics do the same thing for people. I didn't think I'd get through this without this, but like, you can't not want to help people. And when people see, and people are seeing like, part of my whole story that you've even heard about is my struggle with depression, my struggle with anxiety. And you see people who are able to, like, their needles are drastically moved as a result of experience with psychedelics in a way that nothing else helped. I put down suicide when I was 10 years sober, 3 years into a depression diagnosis, on disability for a year, asking God every morning why I shouldn't kill myself for 7 straight months. I put it down when I realized that after 7 months, I wasn't probably actually going to do it. So I had to stop thinking about it and talking about it and figure out what it meant to do if you were going to stay alive. And I started doing those things. Like, that's where I was at 10 years of sobriety. And to think that psychedelics could have helped me move through it rather than the mess I was in with pharmaceuticals. I was knee deep in it. It was like a shit show where I was with pharmaceuticals. The drugs I came on and off of, and the doctors that didn't help me. To think that I could have sat with a healer and been taken through a journey and healed.
It's so powerful. Actually, interesting, this talk about the decisions that we had to make around suicide. My first psilocybin journey, I had to come back to that. It turned out that, even though I had worked in sobriety to not have this be an option for me anymore, my spirit was still holding on to this. And that's why, I still had a lot of rage. That's what the PTSD was, is I still had a lot of rage. And my spirit still was not convinced that we should stay here among the humans who don't know how to love themselves and don't know how to love each other and are constantly hurting and violating and destroying each other. Why should we stay here? And the psilocybin journey really moved me to a deeper place of connection, moved my spirit to a wider scope of view, like nothing ever was able to do. And now the notion that I would leave here sooner than my time, and the notion that I am separate and alone and discarded and forgotten, all of that is wiped away. It's all wiped away, right? So, I am with you that if we have this opportunity to heal, why wouldn't we do that? Legalize psychedelics. Don't punish people for using them. So decriminalize, legalize, whatever it is, just don't punish people for doing this.
Agreed.
Yeah.
And I think that will help the cause of access.
Yeah, I agree.
my shingle will be out there the minute it can be.
Absolutely. Well, Kat, I want to thank you so much for the time. And what I hope is that the next time we have a conversation, so hopefully there is a next conversation for us to have. And the next time we have it, it's because your shingle's out. And now it's time to talk about something else. Now it's time to talk about like doing the real stuff.
Yeah, that'll be awesome. That'll be really exciting. Thank you so much for having me. The conversation's been awesome, and I would look forward to speaking to you again even before that happens.
Awesome. Fantastic. All right, Kat, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That wraps up another episode of Keys to the Kingdom. Thanks so much for listening. Check out the show notes for resources we discussed, and follow the Keys conversation on Twitter at Psychedelics Key. Until we meet again, remember, you are connected, you are love, and the kingdom is yours.